Welcome, everyone. Those of you filtering in, please, there are a couple of seats up front still, and everyone else. We got a packed house today, so there's a few seats left, but everyone make room. My name is Stuart DeCue. I'm the program director at the Yale Center for Business and the Environment, and we're thrilled today to have the second talk in our Colloquium on Sustainability Marketing series. This is sponsored by DECRA, and coordinated by the Yale Center for Business and the Environment and the Yale Center for Customer Insights in partnership with a media partner, Sustainable Brands. The Colloquium on Sustainability Marketing at Yale, sponsored by DECRA, aims to unravel and address the challenges of creating environmentally sustainable products, services, and brands that customers love. This is the second talk in a six-part series that will run throughout the year, exploring multiple perspectives from leading brands who are pushing conversation, thought, and action in this area. There's a number of people we want to thank for this series coming together. It's really been something that a lot of us have put a lot of time, effort, and energy into. I'll get to thanking our sponsor, Anastasia O'Rourke from DECRA, who, if anybody's interested in sustainability consulting and work in this area, is the best combination. She is a local presence with a global company. So for any student that's interested in this, a great person to talk to and chat with. Marissa Galizia and Laura Franceschini are two of the students that have been instrumental in making sure that this all comes together and happens in the correct way. And finally, we really want to thank, in particular, we'll get to introductions in a bit, but we want to thank Vincent Stanley from Patagonia. For those of you who were here last year, Vincent spent 2 days on campus meeting with folks, talking with people, really getting a whole group of students in the community around here engaged on this topic. And from that, we had a series of subsequent meetings and conversations. And at a very early stage, he helped us think through how we wanted to present this series, the kind of topics that we wanted to address, the things that were really important for us, and was just extremely generous with his time and energy and insight. And so before we get started, I just wanted to thank Vincent because he really played a huge role in getting this all together. And without further ado, I'll introduce our sponsor, Anastasia O'Rourke, who's a principal at DECRA Consulting, Sustainability and Performance Excellence. She's also the co-chair of the Sustainable Purchasing Council and a member of the advisory board of the UNEP Sustainable Public Purchasing Initiative. Anastasia, please come on up. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. Just two seconds of welcome, really. What a thrill it is to have you here. Such a leading company, leading brand, and we're really excited to hear everything that you are able to share with us today. And welcome also to those participating in the webcast. If you have questions when we get to question and answers, please type them in the chat, and we have students here who are moderating that, and we'll transmit those up to our speakers. And it's my pleasure to introduce Marion Schertau, who is our moderator for the session today. She is the Professor of Industrial Environmental Management here at Yale, and she is also the President of the International Society for Industrial Ecology. Expert in this topic, expert in supply chains, is a fun, great moderator, and I'm honored also because she was one of my PhD advisors here. So it's always lovely to be on the podium. So welcome, and over to you, Marion. Thank you.
Thank you. It's great when one of your former PhD students is now sponsoring a wonderful lecture series with great aplomb. So thank you, Anastasia. Thanks to Stu and to the Center for, what are you called now? Center for Business and the Environment at Yale. Is it still at Yale? Is it at the World? Stu's been doing a fabulous job, and I also want to thank Marissa and Laura, who prepped me so that I would pronounce a few things right, I guess. And by way of introduction, I would just like to tell you my first two very memorable experiences about Patagonia. Back in the 90s, we had a dean named Jerry Cohen. He's the only dean we've ever had who was an engineer. And he's just retired. He went directly from here to Carnegie Mellon University, where he was president for the last 15 years. And he has done a wonderful job there, so he's a great guy. And he wasn't quite as familiar with fundraising at environmental companies. So somebody in our development staff sends him out to visit Patagonia, and he's trying his best to understand what's going on in the culture, and he's got some meetings set up, and all of a sudden he hears, "Surf's up!" And of course, everyone leaves their desk, and, well, you can guess what they do next. They go surfing. So that's one of the advantages of location. And that was a great way for Jerry to really understand the culture. In fact, the founder of Patagonia, Yvon Chouinard, has been a guest here at the school several times. And his first book was called Let My People Go Surfing. So you can see that culture is strong at Patagonia, as these little stories tell you. The other thing I must acknowledge is my colleague Reed Lifset is here, the editor of the Journal of Industrial Ecology, and we're now on what volume? 18 years of publishing the journal, and in the very first issue, we had a great story about Patagonia. One of the authors was Mike Brown, who's still our very good friend, was at Patagonia for many years and is now one of the great environmental consultants in the field. So we have a little bit of the culture. We don't shout "surf's up" much around here, but you know, with climate change and everything.
Can happen.
So there are at least 3 stories here. Everyone from Patagonia talks about stories, and 2 of the stories are Vincent and Jill, and the other is the story of Patagonia. So I'm just going to briefly introduce Vincent and Jill so you officially know who they are in case you missed it. But I'm going to ask you both to say a little bit more about who you really are and how you might describe yourself as you share with us the context and the story of Patagonia. Many of us think we know, but there are a lot of, whenever I talk with anyone from Patagonia, there's always some subtleties and new ways of understanding how you became such a unique and important brand in proving out so much of what we today call sustainability. So Vincent Stanley is officially acting vice president of marketing, but as I learned last year, he's really one of the founders with Yvon Chouinard, and certainly aide de camp and trusted vizier. Patagonia was founded in 1973, and Vincent, you've been there since the beginning, so you know lots of tales. Let me just say a couple of other things about Jill. As you wouldn't be too surprised, Jill's title is Director of Environmental Strategy, but the truth is she's been at Patagonia since 1989. So she's been everywhere, you know, from the Fabric Laboratory to the Footprint Chronicles, many of us recall. Both of you have been heavily involved with the Common Threads Partnership, and that's the one where every Patagonia product can be returned for recycling. And so you've really been key not only to the business, but also to promoting and expanding the culture that's so special at Patagonia. So I guess for Founders Tales, we should turn to you, Vincent, and then to Jill.
Okay. It's interesting that you mentioned Surf's Up, because I actually, it was a great career move for me in Patagonia not to surf. I came to work at the company intending to work for about 6 months. My uncle is Yvon Chouinard, so the shop, as we called it, Chouinard Equipment, was about half an hour away. And I started off as a packer, but pretty soon it became apparent that when the surf was up, I was the only one who answered the phones. So I was made sales manager at the age of 21, and did that for about 20 years. And then I wanted to, I realized that 3 to 6 months had gone on for 20 years, so I left the company to teach myself how to write, and continued to write also for the company and to be involved in some of its major programs. And then came back about 10 years ago as the head of the editorial department, and got engaged with Jill in creating the Footprint Chronicles and some of the Common Threads programs, and then got snookered into taking the role of VP of Marketing for the last year and a half, which is now coming to an end today. So we have the permanent replacement is starting in Ventura in about 30 minutes.
Unless the surf's up.
Unless the surf's up. No, she's from Boston, so she may not know. And just a couple of words of context. I think it's interesting to have, if the title of this talk is Don't Buy This, and Patagonia as an aspirational company, you might wonder what are we aspiring to, particularly if we're a consumer products company that talks about don't buy this. And I think that ultimately what we're aspiring to is to be a company 10, 15, or 20, or 50 years down the line that actually justifies its existence, that is worthy of being a company in business. And I think that this aspiration has come to us very much over time, over the course of the 40 years. We did not start out wanting to be anything but the company that made the best mountain climbing equipment, and then the company that made the best clothing for layering for the mountains. But because we had come out of the surfing and the mountaineering worlds, I think we had this strong sense of attachment to the wilderness. I think we've talked about this before, that it's something that's very hard to explain to anybody who doesn't share it, but for anybody who's been more than a mile from the roadhead and experienced the kind of the awe that you feel when you're no longer certainly at the top of the food chain, when you're sensitive to that the natural world is much more beautiful than anything we can create ourselves. And you get this not only in the mountains, but you get this in the surf like 10 feet from the sand when you're out there in the waves playing with natural forces. So this led us, our aspiration that became very early on was to help protect natural places. And this we started doing in the 80s by giving 1% of sales to the environment. But it took us much, much longer to view ourselves, to look at ourselves as environmental culprits or villains, to look at what was done in our name in the supply chain, what we had done in our name in the supply chain, and to really examine our own practices and then gradually improve them. So the aspiration has grown rather than diminished, particularly over the past 20 years. And I think that's what we want to touch on today is, well, how does that work? What happens when you do one thing and it teaches you that, oh, it's possible, we can do something else. So just like that's my sort of setting for the conversation. Talk to Jill.
Good afternoon. Thanks for having us. So I've been with the company since 1989, as Marianne said, and I've had the fortunate position of being very involved in our supply chain and worked in the fabric department and ran the fabric department for many years. And after 14 years of that, moved into the environmental department, which sustainability work became a much more corporate-wide role for me, where I was very focused on product. I didn't really pay attention to our buildings and all that stuff before moving into the environmental department. So I've had the advantage of taking very deep product knowledge, marrying it with the environmental knowledge that I really learned on the job. I was a textile major, so I didn't have the benefit of the education many of you have now, and have applied that to how we can be very practical in that information, understanding how a supply chain works. What are the challenges, what are the benefits, and how do we instill our message to our suppliers and get them to be our partners to do the things that we're trying to do and aspire to. So Vincent and I have worked very closely together, especially on the communications piece of the work that I do, and how do we try to tell that in a digestible way, because so many of the things we work on are quite complex, and you lose most customers after about the first 3 sentences if you're not careful. So we've tried to figure out ways to be engaging to get some of this information across.
Can you say a little bit more about that?
Absolutely. So, I think early on we learned that the points that motivated us as a company to make change aren't always the things that motivate consumers to support our choices. And one example comes from way back in the 90s with organic cotton. And as we learn more about how conventional grown cotton was done at the time, it was really disconcerting to see all the chemicals in the cotton fields. And we spent a lot of time driving around cotton fields to learn this. And as we learned some of that information, that was really the compelling reason why we switched. And we wanted to tell our consumers that, look at all this stuff that's happening. We're really concerned. We want you to be concerned. And so we made posters with crop dusters and all these things. And our retail employees came back and said, you're really kind of bumming everybody out. And the focus groups were like, we're kind of happy when we're shopping. You got your dog and a latte, and now we're looking at crop dusters. And so we learned that we had to meet them where they were ready to be met in the environment they were. And that, at the time, was our retail stores and our catalog. This was pre-internet, which definitely dates me. But we had to figure out how to engage them in the conversation and not turn them off with the very first point of communication. So we had to match and sort of balance the crop dusting photos with a farmer that was growing organic cotton and tell his positive stories and why he made the switch, his personal reasons for getting the chemicals off of his land. And so it was really a lesson in balancing that information, that it's not always the motivating factor that resonates.
So we've introduced a concept that's really core to talking about Patagonia, and that is the sort of the tensions in the relationship between marketing and being a business and sustainability. And the way that you've done it, as you've started to describe, so that the customer can understand. So let me throw out this question. Has the public's reaction to Patagonia, clearly it's influenced you. You've said that you needed to kind of meet them halfway. But how does the messaging that you do sort of shape the company and what the company does, and how does what the company does shape the messaging? Vincent.
I think it definitely works that way. Our initial, how we speak to our customers, I think was, many of you know this story. When we were a climbing equipment company, we were heavily dependent on making something called pitons. You'd hammer those into the cracks. When climbing got popular, the cracks started to deform because there was so much pressure on these roots. So we undertook this process to introduce another kind of piece of gear. It was aluminum chocks that were not hammered in but torqued in. But to do this, we had to persuade climbers who were really trusting their lives on this gear to change entirely to a whole different means of protection. And it took us about 6 months, 8 months to do this. The first thing we did was start to make these chocks that had, they were the replacement gear. They had been made in Britain, but they weren't familiar. People in the US were not familiar with them. We put a 13-page essay in our catalog called The Whole Natural Art of Protection, and that was picked up by all of the climbing magazines. And so within about 6 months to 8 months, we saw this radical shift, so that the business had been 70% reliant on pitons. At the end of 1 year, it was 70% reliant on chocks. And we knew that we could talk to our customers, if we talked to our customers as grown-ups, and we could engage them with an issue, we could bring about a successful change. But as Jill pointed out, in the case of organic cotton, people were not as interested in that message. But it took us longer, and it was changing with pitons made us confident that we could actually make the change and get our customers at least to accept organic cotton. One of the things that happens with messaging is that the message gets across. Once you have a success doing something, it actually creates internal pressure to do something more. So the messaging, when we have gotten something across like organic cotton, it then creates the pressure, what's our next step? We've made this move to reduce the harm we do by abandoning conventional cotton and using organic. What are other areas of the company that we can make change in, and how do we communicate it? So when it's successful, it feeds back to you, and people start expecting you to become a leader, and you start to feel conscious of that you want to meet people's expectations and not let them down, and also not let down the obligation you feel as a business person to reduce the harm you do.
Do you want to comment on this circle about the message shaping what the company does, but also the company having to respond to the message?
Yeah, I think it's a healthy tension. And so tension isn't always bad. And I think sometimes we look at it as bad. And healthy tension is really good because it makes both sides better. And in our storytelling, we always want to be able to answer every question that might come. But again, we have to be careful with the balance and not have it be this fire hose of information that you can't swallow it, and allow people to come in at a level that they can digest it and become educated. And we see ourselves a lot as educators around environmental issues, whether it's a campaign with an NGO that we're working on or something about our own practices. And learning sort of that cadence of information that people can absorb and then react to and hopefully spring into action. And that's a lot of the work that we do, is trying to get people into action, whether it be our consumers, our colleagues at work, our supply chain, competitors, that type of thing. So, I think over the years, like Vincent said, as we had successes, you become more comfortable in that tension and that discomfort that exists, because you see a problem, you don't really know the answer, but you have the mechanism to find it. So as you introduce new things into the supply chain, new things into the business, you have the confidence that if you stick with it and persevere, you're going to figure out how to manage it and work on it. But you certainly don't know the answer when you're starting. And so I think it's this, it is a circular tension and process that we often go through, often without knowing it, actually. I would say it's become a little bit subconscious at this point.
It's an interesting, I think the Footprint Chronicles, with communication and transparency, there are often happy unintended consequences. When we put the Footprint Chronicles out, our goal was essentially to create a CSR report that people would read, that was literate and then it was engaging for the customer. And so what we did is we featured, I think at the first season, 5 products, and we talked about the greenhouse gas emissions generated, the energy used, the waste generated, and eventually went to water. But we also put in a narrative about, okay, this is what we like about what we do with this product. We use recycled polyester, we use organic cotton. This is what we think is still a problem, and this is what we think we'll do next. So the idea was really to talk to consumers and in a sotto voce way to NGOs who were asking these questions. But the unintended consequences were, there were a couple of interesting things. First, I had been with the company more or less since the beginning, and I noticed after Footprint Chronicles that we had a great reduction in the number of hostile water cooler conversations that come about when people talk about what we're trying to do environmentally and how irrelevant it is to the business. There was still much more of that kind of tension in the company before Footprint Chronicles, when we had actually explained to our own people a lot of what we were doing, and we actually elevated the conversation so that you still have the bickering back and forth, but the bickering is smarter. And then the second unintended consequence, we noticed that our production people who had been kind of nervous when we were putting up the factories on the website and talking about what we liked and didn't like about what they were responsible for, that they started to come to us because they found the Footprint Chronicles a tool for working with the suppliers to improve practices. Another unintended consequence, that we found out that suppliers wanted to be mentioned on the Footprint Chronicles, even if they were mentioned critically, because it gave them some face to the consumer and face with other businesses. So what we had started out intended to do was rather limited, and the benefits were extensive and kind of across from customer to supplier to employee, the benefits and to the general public, because we got a lot of attention.
So I want to break down the we a little bit, because
Yeah.
no companies speak in
Yeah.
one voice, as we've learned at the water cooler, that
Yeah.
there may be different opinions. When you change the message, or you go with a new message, don't buy this, for example, how does this filter through your organization and at different departments or at different levels and so forth?
I mean, I think when we're most successful at it is when we figure out the touch points to a lot of different employees. And it's really easy, I think, to think about the sustainability work internally or the communications to sit in one department, or that is Vincent's job or that's Jill's job. And what I think both of us have tried really hard to do over the years is to spread that responsibility throughout the organization. So for example, with the Footprint Chronicles team, we pulled together a team of people that knew each other because our campus is fairly small, but we didn't work together. We hadn't done a project together. And to watch people shift during that process was one of my most rewarding experiences at the company, because we watched a team come together, put in place really at a directive of the management to do this project. But this group was made up of all different people from the video team, the edit team, the materials team, the web team, and we weren't used to just making all the decisions. And the team went from asking, well, who's going to go tell the vice presidents this is what we want to do? And so they don't, or what are they asking them what to do, to telling them what we want to do. And it was a really important shift for us, because it was this group that didn't feel empowered when they came, yet they were given that responsibility and they felt empowered when they left to take that part of their work into the other parts of their job. And we really saw that flourish, which was really exciting to watch. And it was a really great reminder how important it is to spread this responsibility out into the organization, so you have people in different places working towards the same goal.
And it actually moved out. It was contagious. So we had the team that was responsible for creating the Footprint Chronicles, but then once we started to engage the production staff more heavily, they began to behave just like the team that was working on the Chronicles. So they were tremendously self-directed and self-motivated to get things done.
Now, sometimes I'm teaching a course this semester called Corporate Environmental Management and Strategy, and sometimes there are very difficult trade-offs as you progress. There might be a technical product requirement, and you really need to use something even if it isn't the most environmental product. Can you give us an example of a challenge like that, where you really had to make some kind of a difficult choice in that way?
Yeah, there's a current one that we're in the middle of, actually.
Okay.
And that's around performance characteristics in alpine and ski gear, specifically around waterproofing, and trying to balance what is the performance requirement of a product in the scheme of its durability over a lifetime, and the performance and environmental ramifications of some of the chemicals that are needed to do that. So in our case, it's around durable water repellent finishes, which is what you apply to the outside so you stay dry in a rainstorm. And we have reported, as Vincent said on the Footprint Chronicles, about the use of this chemistry and trying to figure out how to reduce the environmental impacts, yet maintain a level of performance that still keeps the product competitive in the market and useful. That if we were to diminish some of these performance characteristics, the life of the garment is going to be much, much shorter, and it's going to entice people to buy something newer sooner. And so then you look at the impacts of everything else in that jacket, from the drilling and refining of oil all the way up to consumer care, and that's a really hard balance. Do you then reinvest all these new resources because of this one chemical, or do you put a process in place in your supply chain to responsibly handle that chemical and look to see where might you be contributing to the bigger environmental impact? So those are some of the very real tensions that we deal with on a daily basis. And partly what we use to determine some of that is our mission statement, which the middle statement is cause no unnecessary harm. And we use that mission statement actually on a regular basis in the company. And especially when I was in product, I would say to designers that would come and with some new idea, is it necessary for what we're trying to achieve? And one example where we said no was at one point somebody came with a coating that had a metallic component on the inside. And the idea was it reflects your body heat, it reflects back to you, and it's warmer than a jacket without it. So, okay, but how much warmer? Like, are we really gaining something by that? You put on your insulative layers before your jacket. Is it a gimmick or is it real? And is it necessary harm for the increased performance? And in that case, we decided it wasn't, that the mining of the metals and the implications that followed that and the processes, it couldn't fulfill our mission statement. And so we did say no. So there are those times as well where we will look to see, is it really necessary? No, that can be achieved through another way.
Nice. That's a very interesting example because you wanted the real, and that's certainly very important. Now, you're not exactly the biggest company in the country, and yet you want to influence your suppliers, and it's hard for the little guy to influence suppliers sometime. How can you influence your sort of tier 1 and tier 2 suppliers beyond your own work and get the kind of results that you're looking for? And maybe talk even more broadly, Vincent, about supply chain relationships at Patagonia.
Yeah. We've talked about this quite a bit. I think in the beginning there were, when we wanted to work on a problem, we would often find somebody, say a fabric problem, or go back to the case of when we needed to find catalog paper with recycled content that could be FSC certified, that was capable of reproducing high quality photographs. In a lot of cases, we find partners for two reasons. One, we find somebody because we have a reputation for doing environmental work, and they team up with Patagonia, they get a kind of luster from that association. But also, in many cases, we work with people who have an interest, who want to do less environmental harm. When we got going in organic cotton, the fellow who agreed to be our spinner really did it for moral reasons and not for business reasons. He thought it was a great business challenge in order to meet a kind of moral or personal objective. So those are two ways in which we work with individual suppliers. But the thing that's been a big move for us over we've been associated with a lot of different groups, including the Textile Exchange, including 1% for the Planet. But the big initiative for the last 3 years has been the Sustainable Apparel Coalition, which we actually convened with on joint Patagonia Walmart stationery, which had its one and only use was to invite the heads of 16 corporations. It's been, I want to let Jill talk about that because she's very intimately involved in it. But that is to actually, it kind of goes back to the creation of what is certified organic food. The actual creation of certification, or the agreement on terms, is really significant to making advances. And that's been the first step of the Sustainable Apparel Coalition, is actually to agree on standards, to create baseline memberships, and then the idea then is to make improvements.
Yeah, and I think really a lot of our experience to date is around forming those relationships in the supply chain, and they're critical to getting it done. And I feel like I've told people for 20 years my job is convincing people to do stuff what was not a small undertaking at the time, and we used to joke it was the lunch break, they would spin our yarn. And but today we have another project that's along those same lines, and it's this regenerative wool project coming out of South America, and it's one of my new favorite projects, and it's actually one of my proudest things that we've done as a company, looking back at all the 20 years, because It's actually a regenerative project. And by placing business in these devastated grasslands of South America with these new management and grazing systems, the grasslands are coming back to life and they're actually being regenerated. So we're contributing to making something really good in our supply chain instead of just trying to sustain it. And it very much speaks to your question of the small guys. We were approached by a for-press, not unlike we have often reached out into our supply chain, of companies that we either felt might have some tolerance for this, hopefully interest, or ones like Vincent's example from the spinning mill, somebody that didn't understand it but really got behind it once they understood it. So it's about a lot of education, context building for the larger issue that I got an email the other day from a woman about the wool project. She read about it in the Nature Conservancies magazine. They're also a partner in the project. There's a big article right now on their website around it, thanking us because she was a bird person in Canada that cared about the migratory paths of the birds that land in South American grasslands in their annual cycle. And it was such a great reminder of the full ecosystem that we're working in. And I sent it to our production people. I sent it to the people that get mired in the orders and trying to fit everything together so they see the larger context. But then these smaller partners have access to the market and access to things, and they can see the more detailed things. So it's, I think it's those relationships for me are super, super key, that no matter how small you are as a company, I really feel like there's a way to worm your way in because I've done it. And bliss, I will say, because if knowing now, I would be a lot more bashful, I think.
There's another interesting component. The farmers we're working with in South America are like fifth generation. Some of them, their ancestors came over and not survive as farmers unless the grassland is restored. And one of the shifts in their thinking is they now think of themselves primarily as grass farmers. That's what they're producing is grass. And incidentally, how they make their money, their business model is to sell the sheep that eat the grass. But that shift of focus, I think, is something that
Well, I've asked many questions. I have many more. My students know that I'm very interested in corporate culture and change and types of ownership and succession and all the things, but I think it's more important to really turn this over to the audience and start to generate some of your questions. Noah.
Thank you both for being here so much. This is great, and Patagonia is a really inspiring company. But I wanted to ask you about the decision behind the Don't Buy This campaign and the Black Friday ad. And I was wondering if you could tell us whether there was any internal discussion or what the internal discussion was about whether to put out that ad, and specifically how a consumer products company are doing so many things to make sure those products are sustainably sourced.
The reason for the ad came about as an extension of the Common Threads program. And the Common Threads program, the idea started in 2005. We were influenced by the work of William McDonough. We wanted to do cradle-to-cradle manufacturing, and we wanted to take back every product we'd ever made. So we started on this ambitious recycling program. Within about 2 years, we realized, this is not, recycling is only one component of reducing material consumption and increasing resource efficiency. That the whole classic argument of the 4 R's with reduce, repair, reuse, those were important elements, and there was a reason for the particular order they came in. So we started to expand the Common Threads program to include reduce. How does a company say, we want you to buy less? But the important statement is not that we want customers to buy less. The important statement is that we want customers to buy what they need and to reduce unnecessary consumption. I think basically this is an extension of the position we take in making a high quality product. If you make a product a jacket that lasts 3 times longer than your competitors, or let's say 20% longer than your competitors, theoretically you're losing out on repeat sales, and this is harmful to your business. On the other hand, if your jacket lasts longer and your happy customer tells somebody else, you draw more customers to you. You increase the loyalty of customers who are going to come back to you to buy another product. You improve your reputation. So we saw this as an extension of offering high-quality products, reducing perhaps the number of sales we might get, but improving the loyalty of the customers we have and gaining new customers who hadn't bought from us before.
Yes.
So I can't quite stand up here. Thanks so much. My name is Clara. I'm a first-year Masters of Environmental Management student here at FES. My question is about how you've seen product prices and potentially consumer demographics change with your changing aspiration, and whether or not you think that potentially reinforces ideas that sustainability and responsibility are sort of luxury ideas.
Well, I think with more companies engaging in it, it's easier because there's an economy of scale that develops. And that is a huge part of our business, is economy of scale. And part of our sharing of our information with our competitors sometimes is a business. We actually have set up a little booth at a trade show ourselves saying, please come use some of this wool because we know we can't sustain the goals that are there. So economies of scale help a lot. I think also in the years we've been doing this now, we've seen kind of in the early years, all the green consumers, yes, we'll pay more, and then you put it to the general public, and that doesn't really happen. But I think now we're seeing a shift that people care more about the origin of their products. They care more about where things are coming from. I've said to a few people here, it's always a great reminder to be on universities and seeing the different generations where the upcoming ones are used to this transparent lifestyle. And it's not only comfortable, but it's expected. Whereas even in where I sit, it's still a little like, really, you want to know what that was on Facebook? I mean, and so I think there's this shift, and with that shift, people understand more of what's happening, which hopefully allows them to understand the value of the pricing that exists on it. And the Footprint Chronicles was a big help in that, because I think when marketing is really good, recycled polyester, you throw your bottle in the recycling, you get a jacket. It seems really simple, like you turn the light switch on and everything's recycled in your line. But the Footprint Chronicles started to get to what were the real issues that happen in a supply chain to make these shifts. And then people could kind of understand it a little bit. So I still don't think we're at the point that we can put anything out there and put an environmental benefit on it and charge whatever it is we want. There's still very real tensions around cost of doing some of this stuff and what's competitive in the market. But I feel like we're getting a deeper understanding, which I think will help in the long run.
There's something else I'd just like to mention, because you're all kind of starting out in your work lives, and the conditions on the planet are going to be very different. And if we start to actually, what we have right now in business is private profits and socialized costs in terms of the cost to the environment, or some cost to communities when people aren't paid fairly. And if we start to assign those costs the way they should be, the costs of products might go up. And we might have a very different kind of economy in 2052 than we have now, which is based on very, very cheap, historically very, very cheap products, and the ability of people to buy them very frequently. So I'm just kind of giving you the long-range answer to that. I'm not so sure that things aren't going to get more expensive if life gets fairer.
Oh, interesting. Yes, we got a microphone over here.
I wanted to hear more about your conversations that you have with your customers, and difference in segments and how you approach them, and how you get feedback on all of these different initiatives that you've talked about.
It's not, most of it is anecdotal. We rely on the emails we get. We don't do a lot of customer analysis. I think one thing that's interesting for our company is because we have a lot of pretty devoted employees, and almost that kind of represent our customer base, so they become the guinea pigs. So for instance, there was a question I didn't answer on Don't Buy This Jacket, is how did you sell that internally? Well, one thing is we had a lot of discussion on that. And then by the time we ran that ad, about the only one who really didn't like it was my wife. But we did get a lot of support, and we kind of gauge, it's informal, but so far it's been effective. As we grow, we're going to have to start to do more formal market research. And one of the things with the web, where that's now about 20% of our business, is that you can do rather extraordinary algorithms and segmentation in terms of how you send messages to customers so that you don't piss them off. I just read a very interesting book on the 2012 campaign, and talking about for uncertain voters in Ohio, right before the election, the Democrats had it down so that they knew which, so that those people were not contacted, but they were almost driven to the polls, whereas the Romney supporters were sent 60 pieces of mail in the week before. And so that kind of sophistication to reach customers.
Now, I feel like our customers' questions are getting better. We have an excellent customer service team, so we don't see the vast majority of questions that come in because they're able to answer them. But then we get the ones they can't answer, and they ask us to help and contribute to the answers. And they're getting deeper and more educated questions. And that's a...
Let's go to this side. Make you run a little bit, Marissa. Don't worry about people leaving. There are a lot of 1 o'clock classes, but there's still some people that are here. So,
No problem.
Sorry. So my name's Leora. I'm at the law school. And just to build on the question about consumers' willingness to pay from the supply chain side and the business consideration point, Patagonia has built a reputation and a brand on the sustainability, but for this to really have an impact, what you're going to need is to extend the sort of supply chain practices that you engage in to, I mean, I saw H&M was on the sustainability in the coalition, or J.Crew, sort of more mainstream companies. At this point or in the future, do you branding and a choice that you make on a moral grounds?
Mm-hmm. I think there will always be environmental initiatives that will cost more. But I also think the business imperative is there when you look at the resources in our world, and we're living in a resource-constrained world, that start to have business impacts. And the example I've used this morning in a couple discussions is the drought in Texas. A couple years ago was very, very severe, and cotton crops couldn't be grown. So big cotton businesses that rely almost exclusively on cotton for their sales had to shift, and they lost sales because the raw material wasn't there. So when you look at resources that are shifting, diminishing, that are constrained, if you're working with mills and supply chains that are very efficient, and this might be more the case of water in a dye house type of thing, in 10 to 15 years, they're probably the ones that are going to be here. So I think we're starting to see examples. It's not overall every year, but we're starting to see incidents that are really real from a business imperative, that if you are working with efficient amount of resources, you probably are going to survive longer. So right now, it might be a little bit more expensive. Right now, it might take a little bit more work, but really when I look at how we evaluate our supply chain, that's part of it. And we want to be working with vendors that can be in business in 10 to 15 years, that can operate in a resource-constrained environment, because I really think that's where we're heading. So I don't know if that gets at the gist of it, yeah?
that's great. I think I'm going to reserve the last question for myself because it's a little sensitive and I want to be the one who asks it. But we talk about the values of the founder. We talk about internal pressures and external pressures. And there's a different mix of all of those at every company and in every organization. And, Yvon Chouinard is such a well-known, iconoclastic figure, iconic and iconoclastic, I think. And we've seen it interface, and we've seen some changes. Apple, something's going to happen, and that just happens to all of us, I think. And what happens when the founder or the visionary or the values of the founder permeate, and if the founder's no longer there, what happens and where do you go?
I think it will be very difficult for, Eval is already kind of starting to withdraw from, I mean, he was never an active manager. He always spent 6 months away from the company, but he intervened wherever he felt necessary, and he was instrumental in product for a long time. He's starting to back off now. He's almost 75. But I think there are a couple of things that are in our favor, or three things. One is that the family will continue to own the company, and the kids have grown up with the same values as their parents. The second is we were able to become a B Corp. B Corps became legal in California last year, and we were among the first companies. So we can actually write our values into our charter and our articles of incorporation. And in our case, we wrote it in that it requires, any change in those values requires a unanimous vote of the board. You don't have to do that if you want to be a B Corp, but we did. So those are two advantages, the family being a B Corp, but the third is also the strength and the passion of the workforce at the middle management level. That I think has time and again actually kept us on course, because the knowledge of processes runs very deep within the company, and people care. So, 10 years from now, take a look and see what you see, but I see the natural shifts that come and the jockeying that come whenever you have a big change in the company. Fortunately for us, we've been in a constant state of change for 40 years. It won't be anything greatly new to be there.
Well, that's something to be applauded, and we want to thank you very much for joining us and sharing your great thoughts.
Thank you.